Hey everyone, Mario again, coming at you with another literature review, and as you can tell from up there, it is of the first entry in Stephen King's long-running Dark Tower series, The Gunslinger. As you can tell from the cover, this is the revised and expanded edition that he published in 2003, mainly because as the years went by and he wrote more and more entries in the series, his original ideas of the world of the Gunslinger changed slightly. Certain things were set in stone, other things were expanded on. Things changed. Like the thing he mentions in the opening part of this book is that Forson originated as the name of a town, and it changed into the name of a revolutionary. So he changed that in the book. And there's other stuff that I'll mention in passing later, but it wasn't until book 3, which this is something I probably noticed subconsciously the first time I read through the series, that King really got a sense of what this world was like. And he would tell people, when they would ask him in letters, like, wait till the third book, then you'll really get into it. And he would ask for forgiveness on stuff with the first book. So he decided to go back around the time that he had done the last 3 entries and revise the book. You know, take out weird little moments and bits that did not go anywhere in the overall grand scheme of the series, and changed it so it would be more in line with the continuity of later entries. Which I think is a wise idea. And plus, as he puts it in his mind, the original version of the first book is a young man's book with young man's problems. Not to say that it's not a bad read like he says it is. He said it was a clunky read. I got through it okay. I say I definitely prefer the prose style of later entries, specifically 3 and 4. I think those are my favorite. Now, a weird little thing is that it's actually a collection of 5 short stories, or how King originally wrote them. They were 5 short stories interconnected, but they're published as one novel. They are The Gunslinger, which was originally published in 1978, The Way Station, 1980, The Oracle in the Mountains, 81, The Slow Mutants, also 81, and The Gunslinger and the Dark Man, which was changed in this one to The Gunslinger and the Man in Black, also 81. They were February, July, and November respectively, and they were all published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Now, the entire length of the story is Roland Deschain, the last gunslinger, crossing the Mohaine Desert after the Man in Black. I mean, the novel begins with one of the best opening lines of literature, and possibly King's best opening line. The Man in Black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. That is the opening line that authors dream of. An opening line that sets the tone for the series and makes you want to keep going. Now, throughout the first part, we find out a little bit about Roland. We get a sense of his world, his quest, why he wants to go after the Man in Black. We get a sense of how good of a shot Roland is when he tells the story of how he killed everyone in a town called Tull because the Man in Black left a trap for him there. He tells the story to this man called Brown, who is a farmer who lives by himself, with the only company being a Kroll named Zoltan, who basically says weird things like, "Screw you and the horse you rode in on. Magical fruit," stuff like that. He tells the tale, and it is very tragic, and this sets the tone for a lot of Roland's stories. In the way station, he meets a boy out in the middle of the desert at a random way station. It's such a random meeting that at first he believes the boy is a mirage. The boy is Jake Chambers, and apparently he comes from our own world. And he came here through a portal called Death. Now, the way that Jake tells him how he died via hypnotism, Roland believes that it was the Man in Black somehow traveling from one world to another that caused Jake to die by pushing him into traffic. Now, in the following novel, we're going to find out different, but that's jumping ahead, and to quote a member of Iron Maiden, "Oh, that would be telling." They, get to know each other, and Jake joins the gunslinger on his journey. Then the next one is the Oracle in the Mountains. At this point, the two have finished crossing the desert, and they're about to start the journey up the mountain to catch the Man in Black. While they're camping there, waiting a couple days to recover between desert and mountain, Jake wanders off. The gunslinger goes and finds him around these stones, and there's an oracle there. Now, this oracle is also a succubus, so I think you know what Roland's going to have to end up doing in order to get her prophecy. And she tells him that 3 is the number of his fate, and that he'll have to draw 3. This, of course, goes in with the next volume called The Drawing of the 3. Now, the two eventually make their way up through the mountains, and Roland eventually has to make a painful decision, which I'm not going to go into here because that is a major spoiler, but it's hinted at all throughout the book from the time he meets Jake. I think that kind of tells you. All I'm going to tell you is one line that is said near the end of this, and that is, "Go now, there are other worlds than these," which is the hint that the two worlds that we've seen thus far, the world of the Gunslinger and the world that Jake comes from, are not the only worlds, which is a plot point that is shown in the last 3 volumes, but that's jumping ahead again. The last one is the long palaver between Roland and the Man in Black. And the way King writes this out, you can really get a sense of how long Roland has been chasing after this man, and how much he wants to talk with him, and how much he wants to kill him. Because as we find out as the conversation goes, this man is the man who seduced Roland's mother and helped escalate the fall of Gilead. Because that's other stuff we learn throughout the story. We learn about Roland's backstory. We learn how he became a gunslinger, how he challenged his teacher Court when he was 14, which was the youngest a gunslinger had ever challenged for their guns and won, 2 years younger than his father. And he did it mainly because Martin orchestrated a thing to get him to fail, basically, because he thought that Roland would challenge for his guns and lose. Because he's been having an affair with his mother, and he basically calls him into the room, and you could tell that they probably had done something not that long ago from the way they're described to be dressed. Roland can tell, but he doesn't bring it up. And it's just his annoyance, and of course something that happens right when he leaves the room, when he hears a slap and Martin saying, "Shut your quack," that sends Roland over the edge, and that's why he challenges. We also get to see him uncovering a traitor cook, which that's one of the first backstories we get from his childhood, and another little story involving the Hawk that eventually does help him with the guns. And that's about it in that department. Now, the thing with the manhood test, actually, we learn more about what happened after that in the 4th book, but that's also jumping ahead again. And from what we see in Roland's current time and what we get from the flashbacks, we get a sense of how far gone the world has become since the fall of Gilead. Gilead and the rest of the baronies were the last light of civilization, or how the civilized world was before the world began to move on, and now it's moved on and everything's gone to crap. It's a very post-apocalyptic, dystopian world. Mostly post-apocalyptic in this corner of the world, but in other corners you could accurately use dystopian, like the city of Lud that we'll come to in the 3rd book. Now, the palaver, an excellent scene, and one of my favorite little parts of it is when Martin, the Man in Black, is actually talking about size, how the tower is a nexus of size and how size defeats us. That whole thing, King makes a very great point with this prose, that even though we say we can comprehend it with our mind, at the very end, size always defeats us, because eventually we'll end up with the phrase, "No one knows." And the whole thing about "let there be light," that was an excellent little bit of dialogue. And then, of course, the ending really leads into the next one perfectly. Now, of course, earlier I mentioned some of the changes that King made to this book when he revised it in 03. I already mentioned the first one involving Farson. Other ones was the removal of a reference to Roland reading magazines in Tull, because the following book and subsequent books made it clear that paper is very rare in his world, and little changes involving that were also added to other parts. Reference to 12 years passing since the fall of Gilead were removed because Gilead fell years ago, and as we find out in the last book, and it's hinted in this one, Roland has been at this a while. Court actually is confirmed to be dead instead of Roland not knowing where he was. A smart little change. Small, but inconsequential. The killing of a character named Allie is changed slightly from it being cold-hearted to it being a mercy killing. I'm not really going to spoil the whole thing involving Allie, but let's just say it's the closest that Roland comes to having a friend in the city of Tull. References to the Beast were changed to that of the Crimson King, because I think this early on, King had an idea there was going to be a big baddie near the end, but he didn't know exactly who. But by the time he'd gotten around to revising it, he knew it was going to be the Crimson King. Taheen appears early in the book. That's a race that didn't appear until the final 3 entries. They're basically Stephen King's equivalent of furries, but instead of all being like all animal all over, just humanoid, they're basically human body, animal head, and hands and feet change slightly depending on whatever type of creature they are. They technically can mate with humans, and we get the Lomans, in case you're wondering what those are. They're like these weird rat-looking creatures. Jake's age is beefed up from 9 to 10 to 11, how it was in the rest of the series. A lot of references that King made in the original version of the book to holidays we have, like All Saints Day, Easter, Greek and Egyptian gods, Polaris, Mars, Jesus. Well, Jesus is still mentioned, but just not as much as it is here. Jesus is still mentioned, just not in the same way that he was in the original. All these things made Roland's world seem like a rundown version of ours, where is the change? You can see the similarities, but it's not quite clear if Roland's world is a rundown version of our own or an alternate reality, where things went way different earlier on. It's one of those little subtle changes that I think makes the world work in a little bit better of a way. And also, one thing that's added is the word resumption at the beginning, which makes you scratch your head a little bit, along with some other little tiny moments, until you get to the last novel. Then you're like, oh, these make a lot of sense. They're very, very subtle moments that if you read through it the first time, you're like, what's he mean by that? What's he mean by that? But then by the time you get to the 8th book, you're like, oh, I see what he means. Clever, clever. You're revising around the time you finish the series, so you might as well add little hints like that. Those of you who've read the books already know what I'm referring to. I'm just not going to spoil it for those who haven't. Now, at the end of the day, The Gunslinger is an excellent novel. I definitely would probably put it in my top 20 of King's novels. I don't know if I'd put it in my top 10. It might get up in there. Definitely a book I like to reread a lot. It's definitely, out of all of the Dark Tower books, it's the one I can reread the easiest, mainly because out of all of them, it's the one that feels like it's the most standalone. Because the rest of them, they don't really have that feeling. Because this one, he could have ended it with the way he did and not write another book in the series, and it would have had an ending that would have, wanted you to know what happens afterwards, but it still has a little bit of finality about it. Whereas the rest of them, especially the ending of 3, and the only other one that really has a sense of finality, besides, of course, the 8th book, with the final book in the series, so of course it's going to have that, is book 5, technically 4.5, because it was written later on, went through the keyhole. And that's because the way the end is written is it leads directly into 5, and then say thank you is the last word, if I remember right. So since that one's a mid-quill, it definitely has a sense of finality, but in a different manner. Now, all I could say is if you are a fan of King's books, his films, and you have not read The Gunslinger, if you don't feel like actually reading it, the audiobook is always available. You can get it on Amazon, you can get it on Audible. The audiobook is actually pretty good. It's read by George Guidell, and he does actually bring The Gunslinger to life in a pretty good way. It's only a 4-part audiobook, if I remember right. Well, you can get through it in a couple hours. I mean, I've listened to it before on an airplane. It's a good way to pass a couple hours up in the air. And of course, with the movie sequel adaptation coming out, this is the perfect time to read it, and that's actually part of the reason I reread them.